Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of Center for Transportation webinars. We hope you're all staying safe and healthy during these uncertain times. Today, we're discussing transportation and the nation's food supply with Dr. Andrew Novakovic. Dr. Novakovic is a professor of agricultural economics at Cornell University and director of land grant programs for the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. His research focuses on the economics of agricultural and food product markets, particularly dairy foods. This includes the economics of food distribution, the operation of food processing and marketing, and the regulation of the United States food supply. Today, Dr. Novakovic will discuss how disruptions to transportation, particularly within the trucking labor force, could rise to an industry-level problem as we continue to face the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. As a reminder, we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So throughout this broadcast, please feel free to enter questions in the questions box on the side of your screen at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentation. And with that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Novakovic.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you about this issue. First, I'd like to begin by saying I'm sure that just about everybody listening to my voice is more of an expert on transportation than I am, but hopefully I can knit together some insights or interesting questions with respect to the role that transportation services is playing, and which is becoming all the more vivid for food and agriculture under current conditions. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from in terms of my background, I've been keenly interested in dairy and milk product food systems, but also agriculture and food systems more broadly. And one aspect of that has been an interest in spatial markets. Over the course of my 40-plus year career at Cornell, I've been engaged in a number of studies and in educational projects related to transportation. One was related to coming up with computerized decision aids that would help haulers calculate their hauling costs and help in the negotiation between the sellers and buyers of transportation services. This becomes pretty important because there's a lot of hauling that occurs in certain parts of agriculture that are done by businesses that consist of maybe one or two power units. And it also helped in rate setting for agriculture. We've also been involved in studies to look at efficient milk assembly, which really relates to the fact that there are often multiple providers of transportation services traversing the same roads. And essentially, we looked at this as a variation of the postman problem, which many of you, I suspect, are familiar with, to try to see what would be the benefit of rationalizing assembly routes. And lastly, we've over the years been engaged in a number of studies using a spatial model where transportation costs was one of the variables that could be used to evaluate the location of processing facilities that sit in between fixed supply points, farms, and fixed demand points, urban centers for consumption. And so it's that kind of experience, as well as my general knowledge of ag and food industries, that brings me to the table today. I thought I might begin by just trying to put into some sort of context the importance of transportation services for food and agriculture from the standpoint of cost, but also from the standpoint of the basic service. And so I've got a couple of slides here that really are focusing on what is the share of final consumer cost on food that is attributed to transportation services. A couple of caveats. The data that we're looking at expresses the values as a percentage of consumer expenditures. So 5% on one slide may not be 5% in another category because we're looking at total expenditures, not total cost. Also, another little caveat, which will become a bit more clear as we go along, is these data that we're looking at from USDA reflect supply chain costs. the cost as experienced by individual businesses, agents along the supply chain, of course, is going to vary in terms of its magnitude. A third caveat that I want you to think about is controllable costs versus costs that feel like they're a lot harder to control. And I think this is important because even though these transportation cost shares don't look to be particularly high, for many of the buyers of transportation services in food and agriculture, they are believed to be one of the costs that perhaps the business is able to exercise a bit more control over and ends up being quite competitive. And I think there's also some additional things I would highlight in terms of what I call sensitivities. At the farm level, farmers pay for shipping for things that they buy. They also pay the freight for stuff that they sell. This is a longstanding complaint of farmers. One of their frequently quoted lines is they buy at retail and sell at wholesale, which seems kind of like it should be the other way around to most of them. Because of this, there is a rather high degree of sensitivity among the farm community about what is paid for transportation services in either direction, but maybe more particularly in the delivery of their goods. And this has led to farmers adopting various different strategies and ways to try to handle what they perceive as controllable costs. Processors sitting in the middle of the supply chain are far less likely to own their own assembly vehicles, but quite a few invest in delivery fleets, which, depending on the nature of their business, may be trucks or maybe tractor trailer units. Other end users, food manufacturing, food service, food retailing, will have a variety of transportation solutions. As you well know, a lot of people who are using distribution centers will have their own fleets to deliver to individual stores. Food service is much more likely to rely on Cisco, US Foods, and those kinds of vendors, especially if they're smaller scale food service organizations. Another sort of caveat or sensitivity that I want to put out here right from the beginning is the notion that when you're buying services, part of it is a cost, but part of it is also the quality of the service. And when you ask the question, what's better from the standpoint of the buyer of transportation services, certainly cheaper is always a pleasant outcome, but the quality of the service is probably even more important. And I suppose anyone would say the same, but I would posit that this is particularly true in the case of food and agriculture, where quality is particularly critical on timeliness, on safety of the product, and the care of the handling of the product, which is about damage, which is not quite the same as a safety issue. Also, as we get into this, I want to highlight differences by the channel of distribution. So, for example, food retailing versus food service. Also by things like where is the product consumed, at home or away from home, which is more of the end stream user effect, but is part of this channel effect. And to highlight the importance when we look at individual foods of the perishability and or the bulkiness of the food item in terms of how it relates to transportation, and how the buyer of transportation services or the seller, if we're looking on the assembly side, might view transportation issues. So in this first slide, which you've already had a chance to look at, this is a very high-level picture of the magnitude of transportation services for food in general. So in the middle of the slide is the all food category, where transportation comes in at 3.4 cents of total expenditures in this USDA food dollar depiction. It's labeled as 3.4 cents, but of course on a dollar that's equal to the percentage. And you'll note that if we look at food consumed at home, the transportation component of that food dollar is 2 points higher. It's not specified in this chart on the food away from home, but actually the transportation component on food away from home is 2 points lower. Now, again, this is not the same as total dollars spent. It's a share, but it I think highlights what we might intuitively imagine, that when you're going to more unit loads, larger loads, more deliveries by tractor trailer as opposed to trucks, that food away from home expenditure on transportation is less intense than when we're looking at home. That's all kind of a large high-level framework, but you'll see from this slide, and then ones that I'll focus in the next 2 or 3, the share or relative importance of transportation services varies substantially across major categories. This is the full list of categories that were available the last time that USDA did a detailed study of transportation costs, value-added costs, really, for a variety, a disaggregated variety of foodstuffs. So the data here are a little bit dated, but I suspect that the shares today are still a relatively order of magnitude accurate. A little bit hard to kind of see all this stuff on this slide, is a little bit busy, so I've parceled out a couple of pieces to try to give you a little bit more focused look and ability to interpret this. So on this slide, we're really focusing on food consumed away from home versus at home. There are 2 major categories that we can discriminate on. One is food and beverage, which would include any kind of beverage, including alcoholic beverages. And then the all food category, which of course excludes beverages. Also, you can see the away from home component in both of those large scale categories. And then I threw the food at home on there as a reference point. And it turns out, whether you look at all food or food and beverage, the larger category, the general implication is pretty much the same. Food away from home is order of magnitude half the cost of transportation services when we look at all food, and even a smaller share, a third, when we look at food at home. If we measured food not on dollar sales, but on calories or servings or meals, I can't tell you what exactly that relationship would be. But as you would imagine, on a say a servings or a meals basis, food consumed away from home is of course more expensive than food consumed at home, or for that matter, meal kits that you would deliver to the home. But having said that, American consumers, as of the last 3 or 5 years, have spent more money on purchasing food outside the home, away from home consumption, than they do at home. So on an expenditure basis, this is certainly a very large and significant category, although it probably doesn't involve as much quantity of food as at-home purchases do. If we hone in on the categories, the types of food that tend to have a higher share of transportation costs as part of their overall consumer dollar, we see this list that I've put in the table to the right. And if you glance down that list, I think you'll see a few things that start to pop out. This list includes food products that have a wide range of physical characteristics. Some of them are dry. They have essentially no water content. Some of them are bulky and have a high water content. That, of course, makes quite a difference in terms of transportation costs. Some of them are highly storable. They don't require any particular uh, uh, extra measures in terms of handling or the nature of the van. You don't have to haul them in a tank. Some of them are highly perishable that may require refrigeration or at least an insulated van, or even being able to be frozen. Uh, some of them are liquids and have to be hauled in a tanker, although that tends to be more bulk products, not these finished products that we're looking at here. At the top of the list, you see items that are fragile, that have particular safety challenges that require protection, usually in the form of refrigeration, and tend to be bulky. Eggs, poultry, red meats, obviously are fragile products. Fresh vegetables are fragile, subject to a certain degree of contamination, but also really more of an issue about damage. It's not so much about safety from a biological or a human health issue, so much as it is about care and handling to avoid damage. That would result in more consumer denials of purchases. Things like fats and oils are not so much an issue about storability, but they are as liquids or fats that are sensitive to temperature, they tend to be more bulky. And so you can see as you go through this list some of these characteristics that tend to push up transportation costs. There's also an element of this that relates to what is the container that's going to be used in shipping these items. Not all of these items are really very well suited to typical shrink wrap pallets. Some of them require or do a lot better with more specialized containers, something that will hold the fruit, certainly to hold the eggs in a position that reduces jostling. And things like milk, we still actually use specialized crates to a large degree, although that has changed to some degree. All of this, I think, helps us understand these data and also helps us kind of understand how the user of transportation services views what is essential besides having something that just simply moves down the road. It's also the case that because we're dealing with food, we're often in a world where there are additional requirements beyond just having a CDL. These are examples from the state of Wisconsin and the state of New York on requirements for people who are hauling milk. And of course, in this case, we're talking about milk from farms, not packaged milk into grocery stores. Wisconsin and New York, of course, are two of the leading dairy states, so number 2 and number 3. California is number 1. And in both these cases, you have to go through a training program. You have to have a license in order to do what is deemed essential and necessary besides just driving the truck. And this is in particular related to food safety issues, but also deals with appropriate weights and measures. So obviously payment is based on how much milk you sell, but it's also based on the composition of the milk. And so a driver has to be certified as knowing how to measure a liquid in a way that provides an accurate measure of weight, which is how milk is priced, but also to properly do samples so that milk composition can be certified so farmers get rewarded appropriately for the fat protein content of their milk. And as you can see from the screenshot from the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets, there is also a license for packaged milk haulers as well. So I think this stresses the point that there, in many cases, are even regulatory requirements imposed on agricultural and food handlers that go beyond what you would see in general freight. FSMA, which I think many of you know, it was a tremendous ramping up of food safety requirements implemented by the United States government, also has implications for transportation and sort of raising the bar on transportation services as it relates to food safety issues. So this is a concern that the trade would have in terms of making sure that the products that are delivered would be safe for consumers and sort of reward that behavior in the marketplace. But it also has a strong regulatory backbone that comes into play here as well. I'm going to use two dairy industry examples to also make the point that although every supply chain has stops along the way, and transportation is usually the linkage between those stops, these can be really, really simple supply chains or a good deal more convoluted supply chains, and that also has implications for how that supply chain is structured and the way transportation intersects. Consider in this example fluid milk. Farm milk is picked up on farms at least typically once a day. There's a few that are every other day. Some are actually 2 or 3 times a day if they're very large farms. More and more we're using tractor trailers. There is still some truck pickups for smaller farms, but that hauling is highly specialized. You use a tanker that's for food use only. It has limited ability to be used for any other product, and as a general rule is only used for milk. Driving liquids in a tank is a little bit different bit of business than driving a van. And so, the experience of doing that is important, never mind whether or not you're licensed to actually drive a milk truck for other reasons. On very large farms, it's become fairly common for these very large farms to actually own their own tractor trailers and to deliver milk themselves. And this really gets to this issue of sensitivity, of feeling like maybe I can get more control of my transportation costs if I do it myself. That milk is taken to a fluid milk processor, turns it into a product. That finished product is ready to go to its final destination, whether it's a distribution center or a food service delivery point, or directly to the store. If you look at the cheese industry, it's quite a different business. There are many more stops along the way for further processing, breaking down a bulk product into smaller size consumer packages, and lots of different waypoints along the way as well. And that has an implication for transportation. You get into fruits and vegetables, and the chain becomes typically even more complicated as you look at different product forms that can be used. Fresh juices and various other sorts of options in handling those. And even with relatively simple dry food products, you can have a pretty complicated looking supply chain that really starts to relate even more to the channels of distribution that are available for something as simple as chips, for example. There are also a key and important issues that are related to protection of the product, which I've talked about. This gives us a few examples of what those particular additional requirements are. And one key thing is, in a lot of cases with certain foods, we're dealing with two-way packaging, where you have to eventually bring back the milk crate or the tote or barrel or what have you to the manufacturer, which of course is also an additional transportation cost. Protection of the product from a quality as well as a safety point is also particularly important. And one aspect of that is adding stem time to the haul. Pre-cooling trailers, cleaning afterwards, those sorts of things are less part of the equation when you're dealing with general freight. when we start to focus on what's going on right now and what's some of the challenges that are being revealed, on the supply side, a big part of the disruption is simply not having a customer or not being able to deliver to a customer. I would say the bigger problem with the stay-at-home, safe-at-home types of rules that have been promulgated is the loss of a customer because food service is shut down. But there have been some examples where transportation services have been impacted. Another issue at the supply level is workers that are unavailable. They don't show up, or they're sick, or what have you. And this has had tremendous effects, some of which are definitely related to transportation. And for example, on the milk dumping side, as you can see, these are the same trailers that are used to deliver milk to a plant. And so when a farm gets involved in dumping, they don't just open up the valves at the bottom of the tank and let it go on the floor. You actually have to do this in a responsible way. And that means you're still using trucking services, even though you don't have a sale. Also, on the demand side, we've seen a tremendous shift from food service, which is in that bars and restaurant graphic towards the top of the red side, and purchases by grocery stores, which is the big impact on the plus side on the bottom. The question right now is not so much, are we going to forever have food service closed? That's obviously not the case, but the question will be, what do you and I as consumers choose to do in terms of where we buy product going forward? I think we all expect food service to be somewhat restored, but whether it goes back to precisely where it was is a big open question. And I think most analysts would say they don't expect that happening anytime soon, and perhaps permanently so. Going forward, there's all kinds of issues, some of them a little more shorter term, some of them longer term. Worker safety, worker availability is gigantic. Whether or not, when customers come back, which again is not just an issue of government restrictions, but also consumer choices. Part of that consumer choice is, will we be doing more online shopping? Will we be doing more meal kits? Will we be doing more takeout and curbside? All of which, of course, has tremendous transportation implications. And then the issue of what is the general economic effect and how does this relate to household purchasing power? And, what will be, as an economist would say, what will be the demand for leisure activities in a world that feels a little bit more threatening for particularly lower income consumers? One of the final questions that I'd like to address is, what are going to be the responses to this? And undoubtedly, governments, federal and state, will have some ideas about things that they ought to do. And we're seeing actually some evidence of this already. But I think probably the bigger effect is going to be, what are individual businesses and business networks going to think they need to do? And then, oh, by the way, the rather important part is the market going to reward businesses who move over more to a just-in-case model, as opposed to what's become the more standard just-in-time model? And will we see new strategies that previously we identified as too costly now as being too important to not utilize going down the road? So with that, I would be happy to see if you have any questions and turn it back over to you, Romik.
Thanks, Dr. Novakovic. This feeds right into one question we got, which was about whether you see a trend in companies and producers moving towards supply coming straight from the source farms or co-ops in an effort to reduce transportation costs that would otherwise be imposed if there's middleman distributor.
Not so much, but again, that really depends on what the nature of the product is. If you're talking about fresh vegetables or fresh fruits, that model starts to make more sense. But even there, you can't really go from the field straight to the store. You've got to have some kind of packing and sorting to make sure that you're taking care of damaged fruits, you're stripping off unsightly leaves, that you're doing some sort of quality control to identify lower quality from higher quality products with differentiated markets. And so in those cases, that might not be so feasible to do on the farm site, might make a lot more sense to do at a packer shipper location. For other products like farm milk, that's not really feasible at all, because although there are some people that extol the virtues of drinking raw milk, that's considered a gigantic food safety issue. And never mind the fact that some people want to have their milk in the form of cheese and yogurt. So I think these intermediate steps are providing a lot more important services, and where industry sees an ability to direct ship to a final outlet, they're probably doing that already, and I don't think the current situation would change that economics that much.
Thank you. Another question we received has to do with international supply chains. And curious to see your outlook on food products that are supplied from overseas, and whether you think that will, what impact you think that can have on the domestic food market, particularly for
Yeah, well, it's a
consumers.
very interesting question, and of course it goes in both directions. One of the issues is our ability to export, which, oh, by the way, one thing I'll mention is our major customer for a lot of agricultural products is Mexico. So our exporting is actually done with a truck, not with a ship. But one way or the other, the United States is a large exporter of agricultural and food products. In fact, it's one of the major positives on our balance of trade accounts. On the import side, it really depends on what we're talking about. We have absolutely no need whatsoever to purchase dairy products, grains, oil seeds from any other country. We buy European cheese because we think it's an interesting product, and we like to explore that, but we don't need anybody to supply us with those products from the standpoint of our ability to produce adequate amounts of those sorts of foods. On the other hand, we import 50% of our fruits and 20% of our vegetables. In some cases, it's because it's a food we don't grow. We don't grow bananas in the United States, so they're going to come from somewhere else. But in many cases, it's more of an import substitution. Tomatoes, for example, we import a lot of tomatoes from Mexico. So whether it's bringing that product to a port of entry or getting it from that port of entry to a final user, transportation is gigantic. And I think the real big question now isn't so much, are we worried about these foods, because we've understood food itself is not a vector of transmission for an infectious disease, but more a question of what is the ability of the supply chain to either receive those products or deliver them because of human health issues.
Wonderful. To round up, two more questions. One, a point of clarification. We received another one to kind of round out this discussion. One, attendees were curious if you could briefly elaborate on the term just in case model.
Yeah, so this is a concept that has some kind of maybe an intuitive appeal, but it's really an evolving idea. Of course, the just-in-time model, which I think was really kind of popularized, if not created, by Walmart, focusing so much and sweating costs down the supply chain. The just-in-case idea says, well, maybe we better not worry about that so much, because look at toilet paper. Toilet paper is still in very tight supply with empty spaces on the shelf. And the folks that understand that industry keep saying this is an example of an industry that sweat out every last cost in production capability and supply chain capacity with an idea that they knew what the demand for toilet paper looked like. And now, 1 or 2 months later, we're still catching up. And this is sort of the poster child for saying maybe we need to build more flex into the system. Maybe we need to put more stuff in storage. Maybe we need to have unused capacity that we can bring online in the case there's some sort of supply chain disruption. And so just in case is really a metaphor for a number of ways in which we might increase the capacity and resilience of the supply chain to unusual disruptions.
Thank you. And to round out our question and answer period, I know we're a little over time. One thing on everyone's mind has been, the recent reporting showing how much food prices have increased. The highest increase since 1974. We'd appreciate kind of your closing thoughts on, how much of this was related to the COVID-19 pandemic and, the disruptions you've been talking about, and whether or not consumers will be able to or should expect further increases in the months ahead.
Well, I do think this is going to settle out. It's pretty early days yet to be getting too deep into analyzing what's happening, much less what will happen. But I'll say a couple of things. One is the retail end, or for that matter, food services as part of retail, is always a little bit slow to react to changes in price that are far upstream. So we hear all the time farmers saying, "Oh, my price went down, but did you see that go down in the grocery store?" Heck no. And actually, if we look at retail price movements, there is an up and a down to retail price movements that generally mimic what happens in commodity markets. It's just it takes longer, and retail markets employ a strategy I call price smoothing, which means if it's a small change, they don't pay attention so much. If it's a big change, then they respond more quickly. So I think we'll see adjustments going down. But the other part of this that's new that I don't think people are factoring in is life is not the same. We are imposing a huge new set of costs in the middle of the supply chain that are pushing prices down on the supplier end and pushing prices up on the retailer end. And so the market is basically saying, I don't need so much, please slow down on supplying when it comes to food, while at the same time saying my costs are up, I've got workers that are not showing up, everybody is buying plastic shields and face masks and blah, blah, blah. And that's all putting costs in the middle of the supply chain that they're asking consumers to share in paying for. So this is not an apology for that, but rather trying to understand why that's going on. And to also say, I think this is going to sort itself out in a matter of the months ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Novakovic, for all your insight and for sharing some of your work with us. And thank you all for attending and for submitting such great questions. So shortly after this, we conclude this webinar, you'll be able to find the slides and recording uploaded to our website at enotrans.org, where you can also sign up for Eno Transportation Weekly, a valuable resource on all things transportation. So again, thank you everyone for your participation, and we hope you have a great afternoon, and we hope you're all taking care of yourselves and staying safe. Thank you again, Dr. Novakovic.
My pleasure.